The poets, whether they were writing poetry or prose, had a real emphasis on language and the beauty of the language. Storytellers were more like, let me just tell you this story, let me reach out and grab you. And I realized that's the kind of person I was, the kind of writer I am.
Well, if you are queer, and you're a sucker for queer novels, see, there's a joke in there somewhere, you will love this interview. Be it a murder mystery with a queer detective, a golden retriever mystery, or a Victorian-era gay love story, you need to stay tuned to this episode of Unapologetically Queer. Neil Plakcy is the author of more than 40 novels, stories, and story collections, and his new book, The Virgin Homicides, has just been released. Welcome, Neil Plakcy. And first off, I have to get it right off the table. I understand you're unapologetically queer.
I am indeed.
Unapologetically.
Absolutely.
For a long time.
For a long time.
Yes, exactly. So we kind of make the joke. All right. Well, I understand you've just retired as a professor at Broward College, 20 years of the work of teaching our young people. You live in Hollywood. Tell me about what your experiences were like being a college professor.
Well, one of the things that I think is really interesting is how I decided that I was going to be out in the classroom from day one, which was partly due to the fact that several of the people that I was going to be working with had been my colleagues in school at FIU. So I wasn't going to step back into the closet. And what was really interesting to me was the way student responses changed over the years. So for the first few years I was there, at the end of every semester, somebody would come up to me, "Oh, thank you very much for being open. I was kicked out of my house by my father. I was living with my sister who was a student at FIU, and when she found out I was gay, she kicked me out. I was beaten, I was abused, etc." Really sad stories, but they were also stories of triumph, that these young people had managed to move past those. To the point where in the last few years, I had students in the middle of class say, "Oh, my goal is to be the gay Oprah." So they were unapologetically queer in the classroom, in their lives. And it was really a sea change over those 20 years.
Yeah, so you got to watch the evolution of what we all feel and know about LGBTQ plus and our community. Long gone were the Anita Bryant days. Maybe we'll talk about that in a minute. The other thing that's interesting to me from your perspective of the 20 years as history, especially in arts and letters, writing, etc., for students in classroom, I constantly am reading and hearing that while that experience of story improved, the quality and the follow-through of students has actually declined. That with our social media and different kinds of changes, the desire to read and to write has actually declined over the years. Was that your experience or no?
So when I started, we would often have 1 or 2 sections of creative writing every semester. Often they were at night. They might quite often be high school teachers who needed an extra credit for their accreditation, etc. Gradually over time and administrative changes in the college, for example, creative writing does not count for writing credit towards your college degree. So by making those kinds of small changes, we saw a drop in the number of students who were interested in taking creative writing classes. I have always made it a point, because I have both a business background and a creative writing background, of demonstrating to students in the class why this is important. You are going to get into the workforce. Whatever you're going to be doing, you might be a nurse having to write shift change notices. You might be an office worker having to write memos. You might have to write query letters or cover letters for jobs, writing resumes. So I've always tried to emphasize how writing is not just something that you're taking to meet a requirement at the college. It's something that is going to help
a real
you.
application in
Right.
your life. Yeah. It's interesting to me because when you started, there was far less embracement of podcast, of audiobooks. I'm currently rereading for at least probably the fourth time, Stephen King's The Stand. And he re-released, and the book is literally this thick, a paperback.
Yep.
And I have so many friends that go, my gosh, why you would read that? And it's like, well, yes, I want to have that experience and to touch and read the book. As an author and a college professor, is that like a dagger in the heart to you of what somebody's reaction of, well, just read the words to me or give it to me in sound, or I'll read a synopsis in social media?
When I was in business school at Columbia, I lived in New York, and I rode the subway and the bus, and I was always impressed at the number of people who were reading newspapers, magazines, books, comic books. They're reading. And so I really saw that a lot in public. I think, and I can say this from my own experience as well, I think there's probably a drop-off in reading for pleasure when you get into college, when you're in your first jobs, when you're raising your family. Then people are rediscovering the pleasure of reading when they have some time. And I've found that my readership skews a lot towards people in their 40s, 50s, and beyond, because they have the discretionary time to do that. I do know a lot of younger people who are listening. And so maybe they are listening to audiobooks or podcasts while they are driving the kids to school, while they're on their way to work.
They're multitasking.
They're multitasking.
Taking the book in.
So, but they are absorbing that material.
Yeah. And given a choice, you would be happy even in the multitasking of doing the podcast or the audio.
I listen to podcasts in the car all the time.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I'm also curious about is, of course, our show is called Unapologetically Queer, a unique opportunity as a gay author, college professor. I'm curious about the students over the course of 20 years at Broward College. Did you notice any difference in interest of your gay students? Any difference in interest or desire in terms of the written word, in terms of the writing experience? Was there any difference?
You know, honestly, most of what I was teaching them in terms of literature was the literary canon, you know, the books. You know, I had them read and watch a Shakespeare play, just because I thought they should get some experience of Shakespeare. So I wasn't really reading or teaching anything in the queer canon, so to speak. But if somebody would come to me and ask for recommendations, I always had things to recommend.
And let's talk about some of the stuff that you have written over the years. You're very prolific. One of your favorite reads from your followers is Mahu Investigations. And this series that you've done, first off, explain the word Mahu.
So Mahu is a reclaimed word, like queer. What had a very negative connotation for a long time. Technically, it means a two-spirited person, the person who was between genders, the person who didn't observe gender roles, the man who would help out the women, for example. When I first started writing that book, I actually, I'd been living in Florida for a while, and I loved reading Florida crime books because the crime fiction set in South Florida in particular was introducing me to my new home. And I loved that. And then when I was in graduate school, I wanted to write that kind of book myself. But when you have professors like James W. Hall and Les Standiford, who've written great novels in that area, it was hard for me to find a little place in South Florida that I could write about. And then I went to Hawaii for vacation, fell in love, and went looking for crime fiction set in Hawaii so I could learn about that place too. And at that time, there really wasn't much. This is the late 90s. So it was more like a visiting sleuth, kind of Jessica Fletcher goes to Hawaii. And so I thought, I'll write the book that I want to read. And I just started out, I was going to write about a private eye in Honolulu, and didn't really know where I was going with it. Ended up shelving it for a while, went through my own coming out process, and then said, oh, I know why this guy left the police force. He left it because he came out, wasn't comfortable, became a private eye. Started writing Mahu, the book of how he comes out, probably one of the first gay crime fiction novels that merged the crime story with the coming out story. By the time I finished that, my hero, Kimo Kanapa'aka, told me, I'm not the kind of guy who quits. I'm going to stay here. And that's how I ended up writing a police procedural series that's now in its 13th book.
Yeah.
Because I found that I could trace the gradual coming out process in the course of these books. So in the second book, he makes gay friends. In the third book, he falls in love. In the fourth book, he finds the love of his life. And eventually now, from a guy who started out very conflicted about his sexuality, he's now, 13 books later, happily partnered, has fathered 2 children, is a role model in his community, so on.
I want to ask a bit more about the reclaiming of the word Mahu. Does it have roots in Polynesian?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's the two-spirited Polynesian culture.
Yes.
And the reason I ask is you're here in South Florida. I've learned since being down here in South Florida, for both the Miccosukis and the Seminoles, and really all across the country, this two-spirit philosophy of how they approach gender and their understanding of the queer community. So it's similar to that.
It's very similar.
For the Polynesian culture. So you've reclaimed the word Mahu. So we do Queer News Tonight. We could call it Mahu News Tonight and be about the same thing. That's super interesting. The new book that you have is The Virgin Homicides. Tell us about this new book, just launched, just published, I understand.
I started reading a lot and hearing a lot about incels, involuntary celibates. Young men who, because of all of the pressure on them to be good-looking, to be wealthy, to be attractive to women, were having trouble. And they were retreating into themselves and building up an anger inside. And whenever I get an idea like that, it often leads to homicide for me. So I wanted to explore that idea. And at the same time, and as far as I know, there are very few queer incels, because if you can find your way to sex without anybody looking at you or caring what you look like. But I was just really interested in that. At the same time, I was interested in fashion influencers. In these women who are talking about makeup and hair design, and the incels are really against that. So I thought that would be a cool place to butt up a crime. Kimo, as I originally envisioned him, came from a very large family. So again, I was one of the first authors of queer crime fiction to write about a detective or protagonist who came from a big, loving family. So many of the ones in literature are on their own, maybe have alcohol problems, trouble relating to people, etc. So the thing I realized after 11 years was a lot of the kids, his nieces and nephews, were growing up and becoming real people to me. So in this book, his niece is a fashion influencer, and that brings her into conflict with these incels who want to create havoc.
Have you always been gravitated, or did you always gravitate toward stories about homicide, murder mystery? Is that something you've always been fascinated with?
My very first published story was a piece of erotica called "The Cop Who Caught Me" in Honcho magazine many years ago.
Wow.
So I'm writing about queers and cops ever since.
As a literary scholar, I know Honcho
Yep.
very well.
And so I also grew up reading the classics of mystery fiction, and I found when I was in graduate school, I kind of divided my classmates into two groups. There were the poets and the storytellers. And the poets, whether they were writing poetry or prose, had a real emphasis on language and the beauty of the language. Storytellers were more like, let me just tell you this story. Let me reach out and grab you. And I realized that's the kind of person I was, the kind of writer I am. And crime fiction, because of the structure of it, made it easier for me to get into those stories that I wanted to tell.
I'm curious, Neil, your interest in the murder mystery, the homicide story, crime fiction, as you call it. I understand your interest in it, but your lens comes as queer and LGBT, and both in the story and the writer of the story. Is it as popular for LGBT readers, or is it more popular for the broad community?
So let me say, first of all, one of the things that's the themes in the early Mahu books is kind of the pain or the price of the closet. And so a lot of times the crime revolved around somebody who had some problems, who couldn't either was openly queer and was killed or beaten or whatever, or was forced by repression to commit crimes. So that was always something that was very interesting to me, that combination of two. Certainly, crime fiction is a really popular genre across the board. Romance is number one, mystery, crime, thriller, all that stuff, usually number two. One of the things that I found really interesting when it comes to queer fiction is that there are an awful lot of straight women who are reading and writing this material. So particularly in romance, but moving into crime fiction as well. So there's a distinction that you could make in romance between gay romance, which to me is written by a gay man with a gay male approach, and M/M romance, which comes from slash fiction, where people started making up stories about Kirk and Spock, and it was K/S. And those are primarily written by and for straight women. And it's really fascinating to see, and I've given talks on this. Why do straight women read gay romance?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Why?
There's a number of reasons. First of all, straight women like men's bodies. And seeing two men together is sexy. Often, straight men will like to watch lesbian porn. So it's the same thing, only women are more internalized, so they're more likely to read rather than watch. So that's number one. Describing sexy men turns women on. Number two, they love romance. Often these readers love romance, but if you are a dedicated reader of romance, you can get tired of the same story told over and over again. There are things in romance called tropes. A stranger comes to town, a millionaire's baby, all that kind of stuff. If you've read a lot of romance, you get tired of that. Shifting from a man and a woman to two men brings in other tropes, other story ideas, other angles that makes the story seem fresh to them.
Different kinds of scenes.
Different kinds of scenes.
Yeah, that's it.
And third, a lot of those women are mothers. And so they want to see, young gay people have happily ever afters.
So they're kind of imposing their hopes for their male child, for example.
Yep.
if
Or
they
their
turned out-
nephews, their friends' children, their coworkers,
That's
etc.
super interesting.
So it's been really interesting. The downside of it is we're kind of fetishized. And often there's more of an emphasis on the sex in the story between the two men. I have learned so much about sexual positions and fetishes.
And to write about it correctly.
Right.
Yeah.
But I'm not. I've learned about that stuff in those, but I'm just not. I want to write about the experiences of people like me. And I want to write my stories, even if it's a romance, is always going to have that queer lens to it.
Yeah.
And it's always going to be based in things like self-acceptance, growing up in a world where you are different from everybody else.
Yeah.
Whereas the romance is more like, oh, Bear meets Twink, and they have great hot sex. And maybe they work out some issue along the way.
Right. You know, it's interesting to me, and I have not ever thought about fiction in terms of from this lens that you just described. Having been associated, worked with RuPaul's Drag Race for years, the not so dirty little secret is the number one market, the number one segment of fandom for RuPaul's Drag Race is straight women.
Mm-hmm.
It's not gay men.
Right.
Of course, they're substantial
Sure.
and sizable, but it's straight women that have made RuPaul's Drag Race such a success because of their fascination of the representation of it being men dressed as women, makeup, hair, dress, etc.
Yep.
Attitude, and kind of fetish fantasizing in a very similar way. Interesting. And you talk a lot about romance. A very popular series that you've had is Romance of the Victorian Era.
Yep.
Tell us about some of what you've written there.
I started to write this because I found that I was reading a lot of those books and loved them. And I just thought it was a different challenge. You know, I have written a lot of new adult gay romance. I have a whole series, the Love On series, of young guys who lived in a gay fraternity at FU, Florida University, and then they go out into the world looking for love and career success. And I wanted to try something that had some other restrictions. And so the first book of 3 so far is
Titles are
Gentleman and the Spy. And it's a forced proximity story. First of all, that's one of the tropes of romance. Take 2 people and force them together. A young lordling who's been cut out of his father's estate because he's gay is fixed up, in a sense, with an impoverished scholar to go infiltrate a country home and figure with the lord and valet, basically, to find out what's going on there. There's an intrigue plot. I find it's hard for me to write romance without some hint of mystery in it. There's got to be a plot. It's not.
It's interesting. You're doing it from the queer lens as writer, and the hyper focused of a queer storyline in it. What is it about the Victorian era that fascinates the broad community, but the LGBTQ community? Why are we so fascinated with Victorian era in Britain, especially?
I think we have this sense of it being an outpouring of art and literature and fashion, freed from the restraints of some of the earlier era, the corsets and all that kind of stuff. And I also think that we have an idea that gay life was very restricted there. And I think particularly for men of a certain social status, they were able to live more freely than we're willing to, than we realize. So that's part of what I wanted to show in writing that, writing about the beautiful clothes and the fashionable parties, but at the
So
same
there was a
time,
royal and elite closet, but it was thinly veiled.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, and certainly from everything that I've read, we also tend to think of Oscar Wilde as someone who was punished for his sexuality, for being open. But really, it was because he challenged the Marquis of Queensberry, and he made it a big deal, and he suffered the consequences. Generally, from what I've read, the men who were of poorer classes, they were the ones who got punished. The men who were wealthier or had more, social status got away with things.
Yeah, the royal and elite thin
Right.
veil that we're talking about. Well, of course, and the reason I draw attention to these Victorian era themes that you do is Shonda Rhimes has made an industry of it. Bridgerton and the Bridgerton series has become in streaming television the most popular series, and that's exactly what it is. It's Victorian era romance and frequently very gay.
Yep.
In its romance. So perhaps you should send some storylines to Shonda Rhimes. I want to talk a moment before I let you go. I have an opportunity of the intersections of you being a college professor for 20 years. Now you're retired. You're freed from any potential chains of talking about what's going on and the politics that we're watching here in Florida, the politics of education in Florida. And let's make no bones about it, as our viewers, especially at Queer News Tonight, knows, politics and education go hand in hand. We're dealing with the issue about the AP courses and how they're being managed, and Black studies, and what we're watching in colleges and diversity and inclusion. From your standpoint, I always refer to the big D, meaning in the governor's mansion, and the big D not in a good way.
Right.
What do you think about what we're watching in Florida? As a person that has held up the written word and education your whole life, what do you think about what we're watching, especially from your queer
opportunistic.
eye? In what way?
Picking up on the Trumpian, something I was thinking about this morning. I remembered many, many years ago, Richard Nixon was on a trip somewhere, to see people electioneering, and a little girl came out with a sign that said, "Bring us together again." And it's amazing that same sentiment could be done today. People like the big D are looking for ways to divide us rather than ways to unite us. I do believe the pendulum swings back and forth. I'm not somebody who's saying, oh, I'm going to pick up and leave Florida because I disagree with the politics. I think it's important for people to stay here and vote. And this is something that I was very adamant about in my classes. I would say to students, hey, do you know anybody who is here illegally or anybody who's here on a visa? Well, if you want that person to stay here, you need to go out and vote, and you need to vote for the candidate that will protect those rights. And so probably a little bit more strident than I'm supposed to be as a college professor, but I believed in it very strongly. And if I was in the classroom today, I would be talking about, young women, if you want to have control of your bodies. Queer students, if you want to be in control of your lives, this is what you have to do. You have to go out and vote for the candidate who will reflect your beliefs.
Opportunistic, heard loud and clear. As somebody who has made a career of writing a word, whether it be in fiction or nonfiction, what do you think about the attempt to say, wait, we're not going to acknowledge or we're not going to talk about this? And how does that wash over you when you watch the kinds of stories that we report on at Queer News Tonight?
I think it's up to teachers and librarians to resist that movement and to be there talking about those things, sometimes at the peril of their jobs, sometimes, more surreptitiously. I think there are always, like high school teachers, for example, who will see that student looks gay to me. Let me direct them towards a book or two. Just, hey, thought you might be interested in this. So I think that's a way that we get around this problem, is on the individual level, whether it's writing, whether it's pushing books out to people, whether it's voting. It's all up to the individual in the end.
Yeah. Are you, you retired last year. Are you happy that you're out of the process?
Yeah.
You're just happy.
I wanted to be a writer since I was 16. And so it's not so much that I'm happy to be out of teaching, because I loved going into the classroom and being able to have some kind of an effect on young people's lives. I noticed, for example, my classes got increasingly over the years fewer and fewer men, more increasingly women. There's a podcaster, Scott Galloway, who talks a lot about this, needing to make opportunities for young men, whether they're straight or queer. And that was, again, part of the inspiration that came for the Virgin Homicides, recognizing there were these young men who weren't able to meet their potential. Mm-hmm. So seeing that in schools, I think there's a lot that needs to be done. I would love to be still a part of that, because I do like being in the classroom. But at the same time, I have this great opportunity to do the thing that I've wanted to do my whole life.
Yeah, and that's what we brought everyone's attention to. We bring your attention, Neil Plakcy's new book, The Virgin Homicides. We remind everybody you can get more information at mahubooks.com. We're showing you some information about that. Besides the website, where do you recommend? Do you have any preferences of where people find your books and literature? And
if you are a Kindle Unlimited reader, my Golden Retriever books are all on Amazon through Kindle Unlimited. Mm-hmm. And so you can go in and binge read 16 of those for your regular monthly fee. Otherwise, my books are everywhere online.
Yeah.
Both in ebook, in print, and also some in audio as well.
Yeah, and if you're a little lazier, you can listen to your books. I'm only kidding. In The Virgin Homicides, South Florida author and retired now college professor, Neil Plakcy. Thank you so much for being with us today on Unapologetically Queer.
Thank you very much, Al. It's been great.